All right, let's dive into another one. Today, um, it's a bit of a tricky situation. Government funding, but not just any funding, the kind that goes to organizations outside the government doing their own thing.
Wow.
And it's gotten pretty tangled up. A federal judge had to step in to block something the Trump administration was trying to do.
Yeah, that's one of those things that really makes you think about, like, what's the government's role in all of this? How far should their support actually go? I mean, we're talking billions of dollars frozen here, a whole network of organizations kind of left hanging, not knowing what comes next.
So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the Trump administration froze the funding, and then a judge said, nope, not so fast. That's the quick version?
Right. Yeah, that's where we are right now. But to get the full picture, we got to rewind a bit. You know, historically, these organizations, they've always had to cobble together money from different places, private donors, foundations, and yeah, the government too, through grants. This freeze, though, it's like throwing a wrench into the whole system. And then the judge's decision throws another wrench right back.
And the administration is really pushing this idea of being fiscally responsible, making sure, your tax dollars aren't going to waste. They even went and created a whole new department, the Department of Government Efficiency. That's not something you see every day, is it?
No, creating a whole department is definitely a big statement. But this idea of watching how the money's spent, that's not new. Every administration has to figure out that balancing act, right?
Yeah.
Making the budget work, making sure the money's going where it's supposed to. What's different here is the target. This freeze, it's aimed specifically at this one type of funding, and that's causing a lot of anxiety, not just for the organizations themselves, but for, the people they help.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. We need to understand where the administration's coming from, but also what these organizations actually do, why this funding is so important to them, and how the judge made their decision. What's the best place to start?
Let's start with the administration's reasoning. Their big thing is fiscal responsibility, and they've brought up some specific examples, like funding that went to the World Health Organization, or even money for distributing condoms in Gaza. They're basically saying, this isn't how we want to spend taxpayer money.
Yeah, I can see how that would get people talking, especially when you're dealing with, money that comes from taxpayers. But I'm guessing there's another side to this. What are the organizations saying to defend themselves?
Well, you have to remember these organizations, they're all different. They each have their own goals and ways of doing things. Some are focused on humanitarian aid. Others are all about the environment or healthcare access. A lot of them are saying this funding is like the lifeblood of what they do. Cutting it off could stop vital services to people who really need them.
And that seems to be the core of the judge's decision, right? They basically said the harm from the freeze outweighs any potential benefit.
That's a big part of their reasoning, yeah. They said the administration didn't really give a good enough reason for the freeze, and that stopping the money could cause more problems than it solves. It's a legal decision, for sure, but it also touches on this bigger question: what's the government's role in funding social programs, both here in the U.S. and internationally?
So for now, the organizations and the judge are on the same side. But this doesn't feel like the end of the story, does it?
Oh, no. Not at all. The Trump administration has already said they're going to appeal, so this could drag on for a while with everyone just waiting to see what happens.
And while all this is going on in the courts, what about, the average person? How are people reacting to all this? It seems like there's a lot of confusion about what's really at risk here.
Yeah, the media coverage has been all over the place. Different outlets are spinning the story in their own way, and there's definitely a lot of worry, a lot of people not sure what to think, especially about things like Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, those programs that people rely on.
But those programs aren't affected by this, right? That's something the administration's been clear about.
Absolutely. They've said it over and over again. Those programs are funded separately. They're not touched by this freeze. They've even called out some media outlets for, basically scaring people and spreading misinformation.
Okay, so we've got a legal battle going on. The media's all over the place, and the public's trying to figure out what it all means. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to really dig into the details. We need to understand what both sides are saying, what could happen if this freeze stays in place, and what this all means for the future of, how the government funds these organizations and what their role is in society.
All right, so we're going deeper than the headlines, beyond the sound bites, trying to understand all the twists and turns here. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, let's start by taking a look back at how the government has supported these kinds of organizations in the past. Getting that historical context will help us understand where we are now.
Yeah, if you look back, it's It's been a bumpy ride. Some years there's tons of money, then it dries up. Usually depends on who's in charge and how the economy's doing.
So have these organizations, like, changed what they do over time, too? Or have they always been kind of filling in the gaps where the government, isn't doing enough?
It's a little of both, I'd say. The whole scene has definitely shifted. New problems pop up, new organizations try to tackle them. But the basic idea, doing their own thing outside the government, but often working alongside government programs, that's always been there. It's a tough balancing act, though. And I bet it gets even tougher when you add in all the questions about, where's the money coming from? Who's checking up on them? Are they being responsible? Especially when it's the government paying. Someone's going to be looking over their shoulder.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where things can get messy. It's like there's this built-in tension. The government wants to make sure the money is not being wasted, but the organizations need the freedom to, do their thing, tackle problems in ways the government maybe can't or won't.
This whole thing with the Trump administration freezing the funds, it seems like that tension's kind of boiling over, right? They're basically saying, we want more say in how this money gets spent.
And that's where you get people worried about, the government overstepping, meddling with these organizations. Some are saying this freeze is such a bad example. Like, it could make these organizations less independent, more worried about pleasing politicians than, actually doing what they're supposed to do.
That's a big deal. If they rely too much on government money, do they lose their ability to, speak out against the government, to challenge things, to stand up for people who are being ignored or mistreated?
It's a good question, and it's one a lot of people are arguing about right now. On the one hand, government funding can be a lifeline, right? It lets them do more, help more people. But on the other hand, they could get too tied up in what the government wants, and that could make it harder for them to be that independent voice.
So it's a catch-22. No easy answers there. It's about finding that balance. Independence, but also accountability. Needing the money, but also needing to do things their own way.
And that balance is always shifting. It's a constant back and forth, this whole situation. It's just the latest chapter in that story.
It's a story that's happening in the courts, in the news, in everyday conversations, even within these organizations themselves, right?
Exactly. And it's a story we need to be paying attention to because it goes to the heart of some really big questions. What role do these organizations play in our society? What's the relationship between the government and these groups? And what does it even mean to be socially responsible?
So let's keep digging into those questions. What are the main arguments on both sides of this issue? What could happen if this funding freeze stays in place, both now and in the future? And what does it all mean for, whether these organizations can even keep doing what they set out to do?
Let's start by looking at what the people who are against the freeze are saying. What are their worries?
Okay, so we're going beyond the headlines, beyond the, the quick sound bites, really getting into the nitty-gritty, the details that matter.
Yeah, and one of the biggest worries is that vital services are going to be disrupted, like right now. A lot of these organizations, they're the ones on the ground dealing with real problems. Healthcare, food, disaster relief, education, all sorts of things. If their funding suddenly disappears, it could be devastating for the people who depend on them.
That makes sense. I mean, they're working with real people, real needs, and there's a lot at stake. But what about the long term? Are there consequences we might not see right away, but that could have a lasting impact?
That's a really important point. The long-term stuff, that might be even more worrying. If this funding stays gone, organizations might have to shrink, fire people, maybe even shut down completely, and that could really hurt the whole sector, make it much harder to deal with these social problems in the future.
So it's not just about the immediate impact. It's about potentially weakening this whole network of organizations that, they're essential for tackling social challenges.
Exactly. And that weakening, it could make it way harder to deal with things like poverty, inequality, climate change, all these big problems we're facing.
Sounds like a domino effect, right? One thing leads to another, and suddenly the whole system of support that so many communities rely on starts to crumble.
And that's not something we can ignore. This isn't just about money, it's about the human cost. Real people being hurt, communities losing the help they need, and society becoming more and more divided as a result.
This is where it gets real, right? We're not just talking about some abstract policy debate. We're talking about potential harm, families struggling, communities losing access to vital services, a society that's becoming more and more fractured.
And that's exactly why we need to have these conversations. To understand all sides of the issue, to consider everyone's point of view, and to find solutions that put people first.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. What about the people who support the funding freeze? We've heard the concerns, but what's their reasoning? Why do they think it's a good idea to have the government take a more active role in how this money is used?
Well, one of their main points is about accountability, making sure taxpayer dollars are being used responsibly. They say it's crucial to have checks and balances to prevent waste and fraud, to make sure the money's actually going where it's supposed to.
I think a lot of people agree with that, right? The idea that taxpayer money shouldn't be wasted. But how do you balance that with, letting these organizations do their work without the government breathing down their necks?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that people have been wrestling with for years. There's no easy answer. It's about finding that middle ground, making sure there's accountability, but also letting these organizations do what they do best.
And to find that middle ground, you need to really understand how these organizations work, right? The problems they face, the impact they have. It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about understanding the value they bring to communities.
You got it. And it's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There are all sorts of organizations, different ways of doing things, different ways of funding their work. And any approach to oversight and accountability has to take that into account.
So it's about moving past those simple solutions, past those ideological divides, and finding a more nuanced, practical approach, one that recognizes the complexity of the issue and the need for solutions that are both accountable and effective.
Exactly. And that takes a willingness to talk to each other, to listen to different points of view, to work together to find solutions that work for everyone.
So let's dig deeper into that dialogue. Let's explore what could happen next, the different ways funding and oversight could work, and the new innovative approaches that are popping up to tackle this complicated and constantly changing problem. It feels like we're at this turning point, not just with this specific freeze, but with the whole idea of how we support work that's clearly important, but maybe doesn't fit into the way the government usually does things.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. This whole situation has really exposed the cracks in the system. And it's pushing us to think outside the box when it comes to funding these organizations.
So what are some of those different models, those new ways of doing things you mentioned? What are the options for moving forward that, address the accountability issue, but also give these organizations the support they need to actually be effective?
One idea that's getting some attention is social impact bonds. It's this idea of using private investment to achieve social goals. Investors get paid back depending on how well the program does. It's kind of a way to make sure everyone's motivated to get results.
That's interesting. So instead of just relying on the government, organizations could get funding from investors who want to make a difference. But how does that work in reality? How do you measure if something's been successful, and who gets to decide what success even means?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And that's where the innovation comes in. You have to have clear ways to measure progress, solid ways to evaluate things, and be transparent about how everything's working. It's complicated, but it could bring in a whole new wave of funding and encourage organizations to be more creative.
It sounds like that kind of approach would require a real change in how both the organizations and the investors think about things. Organizations would have to be more data-driven, focus on results they can actually measure, and be open about how they're doing things.
And yeah, investors would have to be okay with a different kind of return on their investment, not just about making money, but about the positive impact they're having. It's changing the definition of a good investment.
It's like blending philanthropy with, traditional investing. But wouldn't that also create new problems? What if organizations start chasing after funding instead of sticking to their principles?
That's a valid point, for sure. It's something to watch out for. Any new funding model has to have ways to make sure that organizations stay true to themselves, stay independent, and don't lose sight of their mission.
So it's not just about the money, right? It's about the values, the ethics, the reasons these organizations do what they do. It's about finding ways to support them without making them compromise what they stand for.
Right. And that's where the conversation needs to keep going. We need to explore these new models, talk about their pros and cons, and create systems that ensure both accountability and effectiveness.
It seems like this whole situation with the freeze has kind of accidentally forced us to have a conversation we should have had a long time ago about how we support work that's so important, but maybe doesn't fit into the neat categories the government likes to use.
It definitely has. And that conversation needs to happen everywhere, not just in government offices, in our communities, at work, even at the dinner table. It affects all of us because these organizations are so important in tackling the problems we all face.
It's about recognizing that these organizations, they're not just taking money, they're partners. They're coming up with new ideas, solving problems. They're often the ones doing the hard work right there on the front lines.
Yeah, and it's about supporting them, not just with money, but by working with them, being partners, and agreeing on the goal of creating a world that's fairer, more equal, and more compassionate.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a sense of, that things can change, that there's hope, that you can do something. This is a tough situation, but it's also a chance to rethink how we support the work that really matters, the work that's actually making a difference in people's lives.
And it's a chance to be part of that rethinking, to be part of the solution, to bring your own ideas, your energy, your passion, to create a world where these organizations can flourish and continue to have a positive impact.
All right, folks, that's our deep dive into the world of government funding and the incredibly important role these organizations play. We've looked at the challenges, the tough questions, and the possibilities. Now it's your turn.
Keep asking the tough questions, keep looking for alternatives, and keep having the conversations that are shaping the future we all want.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep making a difference.